The North Sea wind cuts straight to your bones on the ramparts of Edinburgh Castle in late November. Below, the ancient city stretches out like a charcoal drawing, Gothic spires and slate roofs glistening in the cold drizzle. I stood there, hands shoved deep into my wax jacket, watching yellow headlights of double-decker buses crawl down Princes Street like slow-moving embers. My phone vibrated against my hip. Clara. Again. I let it ring out, watching the screen go dark. It was the third time she had called this week, and the third time I had chosen the heavy silence of the Scottish winter over the sound of her voice. 6 months ago, the world was a different color. It was May, and the cherry blossoms in the meadows were dropping pink petals. We had been together for 7 years, since our university days, sharing cheap cider on the steps of the National Library and dreaming of lives spent preserving the past. But that evening, sitting on our worn leather sofa, Clara looked at me with an unfamiliar, glassy distance. She told me she was leaving. She had met Alistair, a wealthy art consultant from Edinburgh's Newtown. Alistair could offer her the world. Gallery openings in Venice, weekends in Swiss chalets, and dinners where the wine cost more than my monthly rent. I was a restorer of historic woodwork, a craftsman spending his days covered in sawdust and beeswax. My hands were stained, my future was modest, and to Clara, I had become part of the background scenery of a life she desperately wanted to escape. I didn't scream or beg. When you love someone, the moment you have to plead for their affection, the battle is already lost. I simply nodded, my chest tightening with a cold, hollow ache. The next morning, I helped her carry her suitcases down the spiral stone stairs to where Alistair's sleek, dark sedan was waiting in the rain. Alistair didn't get out. He just watched through the tinted glass. Clara kissed my cheek, whispered that she was sorry, and got in. I watched the car disappear around the cobblestone bend, then walked back up to my empty flat. The silence was deafening. To keep from losing my mind, I buried myself in my craft. I restored a hand-carved Jacobean ceiling at a historic library in the Borders, living on towering scaffolding for weeks. My world was reduced to the sharp scent of cut oak, the scrape of chisels, and the wind outside the leaded glass. I worked 14-hour days, pushing my body until my shoulders burned. At night, I drank heavy peated whiskey in quiet pubs, listening to the rain, trying to wash away the memory of her laughter. I hiked through the dark hills of the Pentlands under gray skies, letting the freezing rain numb my face. I told myself I was moving on, but every time I passed a cafe we used to frequent, my heart would skip a beat. But while I was healing, I was also paying attention. Alistair was an arrogant man, and arrogant men always leave a trail. In my line of work, you get to know the city's preservationists who care about the soul of these old buildings. One evening, over pints with an old classmate who worked in building standards, I heard a rumor. Alistair's investment firm was cutting corners, falsifying structural reports on historic tenements, and bribing a junior official to bypass conservation laws. My blood ran cold, but my mind became incredibly sharp. I didn't act out of blind rage. I acted out of a quiet desire for justice, both for the city I loved and for the dignity stripped from me. I spent evenings gathering documents and feeding anonymous files to an investigative journalist friend. It was a slow, meticulous process, much like restoring damaged wood. By autumn, the trap was set. The newspaper published a devastating exposé on Alistair's fraudulent schemes and illegal heritage conversions. Within days, the city council launched a full investigation. The banks panicked, freezing his assets, and his investors pulled out. His reputation shattered overnight, and faced with criminal charges, Alistair fled the country, leaving behind massive debts and a very bewildered, very abandoned Clara. She showed up at my workshop on a freezing Tuesday evening in December. I was sweeping cedar shavings when the bell chimed. I turned, and there she was in the doorway, the collar of her wool coat pulled up against the biting wind. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and shadowed with exhaustion. She looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the glamour she had chased. She asked if we could talk, and I quietly poured her black tea. She sat on a workbench, her hands shaking as she held the warm mug. She told me everything. How Alistair had lied. How his grand promises evaporated into a nightmare of debt collectors and legal threats. She said he had abandoned her in a rented flat, fleeing to a tax haven without saying goodbye. She wept, tears carving clean paths through the wood dust on her cheeks. She told me she had realized what truly mattered, that she missed our small flat, our quiet Sundays by the fire, and the simple honesty of my life. She begged me for a second chance, reaching out to touch my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. I looked at her hand resting on mine. For months, I had fantasized about this moment, believing her return would heal the wound in my chest. But as I sat there, looking at the woman who had walked away without a backward glance, I felt nothing but a profound, quiet distance. The love I had carried for her had simply burned out, leaving cold ashes. I gently withdrew my hand. I told her some things, once broken, cannot be glued back together, no matter how skilled the craftsman. I told her about Ailey, a stained glass artist I met during the cathedral restoration, a woman who saw beauty in the patient work of rebuilding and who loved me for exactly who I was. It was a gentle lie, but a necessary one. Clara's face fell, realizing the door she had closed was locked forever. She stood up, thanked me for the tea, and walked out into the cold Edinburgh night, her footsteps fading down the cobblestones. I went back to my work, sweeping the remaining shavings into a neat pile. The city was quiet, blanketed by a soft snowfall that muffled the world. I knew then that the true victory wasn't in ruining the man who took her, nor was it in seeing her beg. The true victory was in the quiet peace of choosing my own worth, knowing my hands, though scarred and dusty, were capable of building a future entirely my own. The ancient stones of Edinburgh have stood for centuries, weathering every storm, and like them, I had survived. I took a deep breath of pine-scented air, turned off the lights, and walked out into the clean, white night.